Elena Rodriguez had been staring at the same maintenance report for 20 minutes, watching mechanics crawl over her warthog like surgeons examining a patient she wasn't allowed to visit. The coffee in her styrofoam cup had gone cold hours ago, but she kept holding it anyway, needing something to occupy her hands while her mind churned through the events that had led her here. 3 weeks ago, she had been Captain Elena Rodriguez, call sign Stormcaller, one of the most decorated A-10 pilots in the Air Force. Today, she was just another grounded officer sitting on a rusted bench outside Hangar 4, watching other people work on the aircraft that had saved more lives than she could count. The official reason for her grounding was pending investigation into unauthorized flight protocols. The real reason was Colonel Marcus Brennan, the new base commander who had arrived 6 months ago, with a briefcase full of new regulations and a personal vendetta against anyone who didn't follow them to the letter. Elena's last mission had been a textbook rescue operation. 12 Navy SEALs trapped in a canyon that every other pilot had declared a no-fly zone. Winds that could snap an aircraft in half, terrain that left no room for error, and enemy fire from positions that made extraction impossible. She had gone. In any way, flying so low her landing gear nearly scraped the canyon walls and brought every single man home alive. The problem wasn't that she had failed. The problem was that she had succeeded without following proper authorization protocols. Rodriguez. The voice behind her was crisp, military, and carried the tone of someone who enjoyed wielding authority. She turned to see Lieutenant Colonel James Parker approaching, his uniform pressed to perfection despite the heat radiating from the tarmac. "Sir," Elena stood, not bothering to hide the weariness in her voice. "Colonel Brennan wants to see you in his office. Now." Elena glanced once more at her warthog, still surrounded by mechanics, still bearing the scars from her last flight. The left wing panel remained unpainted where shrapnel had torn through the metal, and she could see hydraulic fluid staining the concrete beneath the landing gear. Someone had been working on her bird, but it wasn't being prepared for flight. It was being dismantled. The walk to the command building felt longer than usual. Other pilots and ground crew watched her pass, some with sympathy, others with the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to be associated with someone under investigation. Elena had seen this before. Military justice moved slowly, but military gossip moved at the speed of light. Colonel Brennan's office occupied the corner of the second floor, with windows that overlooked the entire flight line. Elena had been in this room dozens of times under the previous commander, usually for mission briefings or commendations. Now, as she knocked and waited for permission to enter, it felt like approaching a courtroom. "Come in." Brennan's voice carried through the heavy door like a judge, calling court to session. The office had been completely reorganized since Elena's last visit. Gone were the mission photographs and unit citations that had covered the walls under Colonel Davidson. Instead, the room featured sterile military regulations posters and a single large photograph of Brennan shaking hands with a Pentagon official whose face Elena didn't recognize. Brennan himself sat behind a desk that seemed too large for the room, its surface covered with neat stacks of paperwork and a computer monitor angled so visitors couldn't see the screen. He was a thin man in his early 50s, with graying hair cut to regulation length and eyes that seemed to calculate the cost of everything they looked at. "Captain Rodriguez, please, sit down." Elena took the chair across from his desk, noting that it had been positioned several inches farther back than she remembered. A small thing, but it forced visitors to lean forward if they wanted to appear engaged, while Brennan could lean back comfortably in his larger chair. "I've been reviewing your file," Brennan said, opening a manila folder that Elena recognized as her personnel record. "Impressive service record. Multiple commendations, 0 disciplinary actions until recently. Top marks in every evaluation." "Thank you, sir." which makes your recent behavior all the more disappointing. Brennan's tone shifted, becoming cooler and more formal. Tell me, Captain, what do you understand about the chain of command? Elena felt her jaw tighten. This wasn't going to be a conversation about her last mission. This was going to be a lecture about following orders, delivered by a man who had never flown combat missions in hostile territory. I understand that the chain of command exists to maintain order and ensure mission success, sir. Good. And what happens when individual officers decide that their personal judgment supersedes established protocols? The question hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Elena could feel where this was heading, but she also knew that anything she said would be used to justify whatever decision Brennan had already made. Sir, if you're referring to the canyon rescue 3 weeks ago, I'm referring to a pattern of behavior that suggests you believe the rules don't apply to you. Brennan leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. Unauthorized flights, failure to request proper clearance, engagement without confirmation from command. Do you see the problem here, Captain? Elena's hands clenched in her lap. The 12 SEALs whose lives she had saved would see the problem differently. So would their families. So would anyone who understood that sometimes following regulations meant watching good people die. Those men would have died if I had waited for authorization, sir. Maybe, or maybe a properly coordinated rescue operation would have achieved the same result without violating half a dozen flight safety protocols. Brennan closed her file with a sharp snap. The point is, we'll never know, because you decided to play hero instead of following procedure. The word hero came out like an insult, and Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't about flight safety or proper procedures. This was about control. Brennan needed everyone under his command to understand that his authority was absolute. And her successful rescue operation had demonstrated that sometimes individual initiative could accomplish what official channels could not. Sir, with respect, 12 men are alive today because they're well-trained professionals who knew how to survive until a proper rescue could be mounted. Brennan's voice remained level, but Elena caught a flash of irritation in his eyes. Your unauthorized flight may have accelerated that timeline, but it also created unnecessary risks for both you and your aircraft. Elena wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Unnecessary risks. As if war itself were one enormous unnecessary risk that everyone involved had volunteered to take. What's my status, sir? You're grounded pending a full investigation into your flight operations. Your aircraft has been removed from active duty for a complete systems review. Brennan pulled out a different folder, this one significantly thicker. I'm also assigning you to administrative duties until further notice. Administrative duties. The military equivalent of sitting in the corner with a dunce cap. Elena had gone from flying combat missions to filing paperwork, and they both knew it. How long? As long as it takes. Brennan opened the new folder and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. You'll report to Lieutenant Colonel Parker each morning at 0800 hours for duty assignment. You're restricted to base until the investigation concludes. Any violation of these restrictions will result in immediate disciplinary action. Elena stood slowly, feeling like she was moving underwater. Everything in the room seemed slightly unreal, as if she were watching someone else's career being dismantled. Piece by piece. Sir, I'd like to request a transfer to another unit. Brennan looked up from his paperwork with what might have been amusement. Transfer requests require command approval, Captain. And I don't approve transfers for officers under investigation. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Elena couldn't leave, couldn't fly, and couldn't appeal to anyone outside Brennan's chain of command without admitting that she was currently under investigation. She was stuck, and Brennan knew it. Dismissed, Captain. Elena saluted and turned toward the door, but Brennan's voice stopped her before she could leave. "One more thing, Rodriguez. I want you to understand something very clearly. This base operates on discipline and order. Officers who can't accept that tend to find their careers limited." She turned back to face him, and for a moment their eyes met across the sterile office. Brennan's expression was calm, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it that made Elena's skin crawl. This wasn't just about one unauthorized flight. This was personal. "Understood, sir." As Elena walked back through the corridors of the command building, she passed other officers going about their daily routines. Some nodded politely, others avoided eye contact entirely. Word would spread quickly about her grounding, and by evening, everyone on base would know that Captain Rodriguez was officially persona non grata. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the tarmac with relentless intensity. Elena could see her. Warthog in the distance, still surrounded by mechanics, still being systematically disassembled. Someone had covered the cockpit with a protective tarp, as if the aircraft were being prepared for long-term storage rather than routine maintenance. She thought about the SEALs she had pulled out of that canyon, wondered if any of them knew what their rescue had cost her. Probably not. Successful missions rarely made headlines, and failed careers rarely made the news at all. But as Elena walked toward her temporary quarters, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not despair, but a cold, focused determination. Brennan thought he had won, thought he had taught her a lesson about following orders and respecting authority. He was wrong. Elena had learned something else entirely. She had learned that sometimes the system protected the wrong people, and sometimes the only way to save lives was to break the rules that were supposed to protect them. And if Colonel Marcus Brennan thought one grounding order was going to stop her from flying, he had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. The sound of jet engines echoed across the base as another flight took off, and Elena looked up to watch the aircraft disappear into the vast blue sky. Soon, she told herself. Very soon, she would be up there again, with or without official permission, because some fights were worth having, even when you knew they might cost you everything. The administrative office in Building C smelled like stale coffee and bureaucratic despair. Elena had been assigned a desk in the corner, next to a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in what appeared to be several years, and a window that looked out onto the motor pool instead of the flight line. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. For the past week, she had been processing equipment requisition forms, updating personnel files, and performing other tasks that could have been handled by any competent clerk with a high school diploma. It was busy work designed to keep her occupied while slowly eroding her sense of purpose, and Elena was beginning to suspect that was exactly the point. "Rodriguez, I need you to cross-reference these maintenance schedules with the flight rotation roster." Lieutenant Colonel Parker dropped a stack of papers on her desk without making eye contact. "Due by 1700 hours. Elena looked at the pile of documents, then at the clock on the wall. It was currently 14:30, which meant she had 2.5 hours to complete what should have been a 15-minute task. Another day, another pointless assignment designed to waste her time and test her patience. "Yes, sir." Parker started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Rodriguez? Colonel Brennan wants to see those incident reports from last month's training exercises. All of them." Elena's hand stilled on the papers. "Incident reports, sir?" "Any equipment. Malfunctions, safety violations, protocol deviations. Everything that happened during those exercises." Parker's expression was carefully neutral, but Elena caught something in his tone that made her pay attention. "Seems there were some irregularities that need to be documented." After Parker left, Elena sat staring at her computer screen, thinking. about training exercises and irregularities. Last month's exercises had included several flights over challenging terrain, some of them in the same type of canyons where she had conducted her unauthorized rescue mission. If Brennan was suddenly interested in incident reports from those exercises, it meant he was building a case. The question was, a case for what? Elena spent the next hour pulling files and cross-referencing incident reports with flight logs, and what she found made her blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, there have been 17 reported equipment malfunctions during canyon training flights. 17. In a unit that had previously averaged perhaps 3 or 4 per year. More disturbing was the pattern of pilots involved. Every single malfunction had occurred during flights by pilots who had previously been critical of Brennan's new safety protocols. Pilots who had questioned his restrictions on low-altitude training. Pilots who had suggested that his risk-averse approach might actually make rescue operations more dangerous. Elena pulled up the maintenance records for each incident and felt her stomach drop. The malfunctions were all different: hydraulic failures, avionics glitches, engine irregularities, but they shared one common thread. They had all occurred during flights that required pilots to push their aircraft to operational limits, exactly the kind of flights that would be necessary. In real combat situations, she was still staring at the data when someone cleared their throat behind her. Elena turned to see Master Sergeant Rachel Coleman, one of the senior maintenance technicians, standing next to her desk with a coffee cup in her hands and concern in her eyes. "Captain Rodriguez, got a minute?" Elena glanced around the office. Most of the other administrative staff were focused on their own work, and Parker was nowhere to be seen. "Of course, Sergeant Coleman." Coleman pulled up a chair and sat down close enough that their conversation wouldn't carry across the room. She was a woman in her early 40s with grease-stained hands and the kind of direct gaze that came from 20 years of keeping aircraft flying in impossible conditions. "I've been working on your bird," Coleman said quietly. "The warthog you flew on that canyon mission. How is she?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." Coleman took a sip of her coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care. "Captain, I've been maintaining aircraft for 2 decades. I know what combat damage looks like, and I know what mechanical failure looks like." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "And?" "Your bird shows impact damage consistent with enemy fire, stress fractures from extreme maneuvering, and hydraulic strain from operating at the edge of design parameters." Coleman's voice dropped even lower. "What it doesn't show is any sign of the pre-existing mechanical issues that are listed in its maintenance file." The words hung between them like a loaded weapon. Elena understood the implication immediately, but she needed to hear it spelled out. What kind of pre-existing issues? "According to the official paperwork, your aircraft had been flagged for potential hydraulic system instability and avionics calibration errors." Coleman's expression was grim. Problems that would have made it dangerous to fly in challenging conditions. Problems that, if they had existed, would have made your canyon rescue impossibly reckless. Elena stared at the maintenance records on her computer screen, seeing them in an entirely different light. But those problems never existed. "Not according to my inspection. Your bird was in perfect condition before that mission." Coleman glanced around the office, then leaned even closer. "Captain, someone added those maintenance flags to your aircraft's file after your mission, not before." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Brennan hadn't just grounded her for violating protocols. He had retroactively created evidence that her flight had been reckless and dangerous. Evidence that would support whatever disciplinary action he was planning to take. "Can you prove it?" Coleman nodded slowly. "Maintenance records are time-stamped. The original inspection reports show your aircraft was cleared for flight with no significant issues. The additional problems were Added to the file 3 days after your mission, during a routine review that Colonel Brennan personally ordered. Elena felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The pattern of equipment malfunctions among pilots who had questioned Brennan's policies. The retroactive maintenance issues with her aircraft. The investigation that seemed designed more to justify punishment than to determine facts. Sergeant Coleman, those other incident reports I've been reviewing. The equipment malfunctions during training exercises. What about them? Elena turned her computer screen so Coleman could see the data. 17 malfunctions in 6 months, all involving pilots who had been critical of new safety protocols. Have you reviewed the maintenance records for those incidents? Coleman's expression grew darker as she scanned the information. Some of them, and now that you mention it, ... She paused, thinking. There were a few cases where the reported problems didn't match what I found during inspection. I assumed it was just miscommunication between different maintenance teams. What if it wasn't miscommunication? The two women sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the enormity of what they were discussing. If Elena's suspicions were correct, Brennan wasn't just enforcing strict safety protocols. He was systematically sabotaging the careers of pilots who disagreed with him, using falsified maintenance records to make their flights appear reckless and dangerous. Captain, if what you're thinking is true, this goes way beyond simple command disagreements. Coleman's voice was barely above a whisper. This is fraud. Potentially criminal fraud. Elena nodded, her mind racing through the implications. How? Many other maintenance technicians would have access to these records. For flight-critical systems, only senior staff. Maybe 6 people on the entire base. Coleman finished her coffee and stood up. But Captain, you need to be careful. If someone is willing to falsify maintenance records to destroy pilots' careers, they're not going to take kindly to being exposed. After Coleman left, Elena sat staring at her computer screen, feeling like she was looking at the pieces of a puzzle that was much larger and more dangerous than she had initially realized. Brennan wasn't just a strict commander who valued regulations over initiative. He was systematically destroying the careers of anyone who challenged his authority, and he was using the maintenance and safety systems that were supposed to protect pilots to do it. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Elena glanced around the administrative office, taking in the mundane reality of filing cabinets and form processing that was supposed to be her new career. Then she looked out the window toward the flight line, where other pilots were climbing into aircraft and taking off. For missions she was no longer allowed to fly. She thought about the SEALs she had rescued, about the canyon flight that had saved 12 lives and apparently signed her professional death warrant. She thought about Coleman's revelation that her aircraft's maintenance problems had been fabricated after the fact, and about the pattern of suspicious equipment failures among pilots who had dared to question Brennan's methods, and she made a decision. If Colonel Marcus Brennan wanted to play games with maintenance records and false documentation, she would learn to play better. If he thought administrative duties would break her spirit and force her to accept defeat, he had seriously miscalculated. Elena opened a new file on her computer and began documenting everything she had discovered. Flight records, maintenance, reports, incident timelines, and personnel files. If there was a pattern of fraud and misconduct, she was going to find it. And when she did, she was going to make sure that everyone who needed to know would find out. Because some fights were worth having, even when the enemy had home field advantage. The sound of jet engines echoed across the base as afternoon training. Flights returned from their missions, and Elena looked up from her work to watch them land. Soon, she told herself. Very soon, she would have enough evidence to take this fight to people who outranked Colonel Brennan. And then she would find out who really controlled the sky. The call came at 0-6-15 on a Tuesday morning. dragging Elena from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. Her phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, and she grabbed it without looking at the caller ID, expecting another pointless administrative assignment from Parker. Instead, she heard the voice of Captain Mike Torres, one of the few pilots on base who still talked to her openly. "Elena, you need to get down to the flight line, now." Something in his tone made her sit up immediately. "What's wrong?" "It's Rodriguez. It's your replacement. Captain Lisa Martinez. She's—" Torres paused, and Elena could hear commotion in the background. "She went down during a training flight. Canyon rescue scenario." Elena was already reaching for her uniform. "Is she alive?" "Barely. They pulled her out 20 minutes ago. Elena, she was flying your old route. The same canyon where you made that rescue." The words hit her like ice water. Elena had been replaced on the flight roster by Martinez, a capable pilot with less experience in extreme terrain flying. If Martinez had been attempting the same type of low-altitude canyon navigation that Elena specialized in, using aircraft that had been flagged for maintenance problems. "I'm on my way." Elena dressed quickly and drove to the base through the pre-dawn darkness, her mind racing through possibilities. When she arrived at the flight line, she could see the emergency vehicles still clustered around the medical transport that had brought Martinez back. The pilot was alive, but the aircraft hadn't been so fortunate. She found Torres standing near the wreckage recovery site, his face grim in the harsh floodlights that had been set up around the crash scene. What remained of the A-10 was scattered across a quarter-mile of rocky terrain, and it was clear that Martinez had been lucky to survive it all. "What happened?" Elena asked. "Hydraulic failure during a low-altitude maneuver." She was practicing canyon rescue approaches when the system went critical. Torres shook his head. She tried to punch out, but the ejection sequence malfunctioned. Had to write it down and hope for the best. Elena stared at the twisted metal that had once been a Warthog, feeling sick. Which aircraft was she flying? Torres consulted his clipboard. Tail number 7-4-7-9. Why? Elena felt the world tilt slightly. Aircraft 7-4-7-9 was one of the birds that had been flagged for potential hydraulic issues in the incident reports she had been reviewing. According to the maintenance records, it had been cleared for flight after a thorough inspection, but those were the same records that had been retroactively altered for her own aircraft. "Torres, I need to see the maintenance logs for that bird." "Elena, you're not cleared for." "I don't care what I'm cleared for." Elena's voice carried an edge that made Torres step back. A pilot just nearly died in an aircraft that may have been flying with no mechanical problems. I need to see those logs. Torres looked around the crash site, taking in the emergency crews and investigators who were already beginning to document the scene. "The logs will be sealed pending investigation." "You know that." Elena knew he was right, but she also knew that waiting for an official investigation would give Brennan time to control the narrative and potentially alter evidence. If there was a pattern of maintenance fraud, Martinez's crash might be the proof she needed, but only if she could access the documentation before it disappeared. Who's running the investigation? Colonel Brennan personally. He's called in a team from outside the unit to handle it. Torres paused. "Elena, I know what you're thinking, but you need to be careful. If you start making accusations without solid proof." "I have proof." Elena's voice was quiet, but it carried absolute conviction. "I've been building a case for 2 weeks. This crash isn't an accident, Torres. It's the result of systematic negligence at best and criminal fraud at worst." Before Torres could respond, Elena saw a black SUV approaching the crash site. Colonel Brennan emerged from the passenger seat, followed by 2 men in civilian clothes who carried briefcases and had the unmistakable bearing of investigators from outside the military hierarchy. Brennan spotted Elena immediately, and his expression darkened. He approached them with quick, angry strides, his usual composure replaced by something that looked like barely controlled fury. "Captain Rodriguez, what are you doing here?" "I heard about the crash, sir. I wanted to check on Captain Martinez." "Captain Martinez is receiving appropriate medical care. Your presence here is neither required nor appropriate." Brennan's voice was ice cold. "Return to your quarters immediately." Elena felt every instinct screaming at her to back down, to follow orders and avoid further confrontation. But as she looked at the wreckage of the aircraft that Martinez had merely died in, she felt something snap inside her. "Sir, I believe this crash may be related to the maintenance irregularities I've been documenting in my administrative duties." Brennan's face went very still. "What maintenance irregularities?" "Falsified records, sir. Equipment problems that were added to aircraft files after flights had already been completed. Problems that made routine training exercises appear recklessly dangerous when they were actually conducted with fully functional aircraft." The silence that followed was deafening. Torres had gone very pale, and the two civilian investigators had stopped talking to listen to Elena's words. Brennan looked like a man who had just been hit by something he hadn't seen coming. "Captain Rodriguez, you were speaking far outside your area of knowledge and authority." Brennan's voice was steady, but Elena could see fury building behind his eyes. "You will return to your quarters immediately and report to my office at 0800 hours for disciplinary action." "Sir, with respect, a pilot just nearly died in an aircraft that, according to official records, should never have been cleared for the type of flight she was conducting." Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "If there are maintenance irregularities that contributed to this crash, they need to be investigated properly. The investigation will be conducted by qualified personnel following proper procedures." Brennan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Elena could hear. "And any officer who interferes with that investigation will face the full consequences of her actions." Elena met his gaze steadily. "What consequences would those be, sir?" "Court-martial for insubordination, falsifying documents, and conduct." "Unbecoming an officer." Brennan's smile was thin and cold. "I'm sure the review board would be very interested in your pattern of disregarding orders and proper procedures." The threat was clear and immediate. Brennan wasn't just promising to destroy her career anymore. He was promising to destroy her completely, to brand her as a criminal and a fraud. But as Elena looked at the wreckage behind him, she realized she didn't care. "Sir, I formally request that my documentation of maintenance irregularities be included in the official investigation of this crash." Brennan's composure finally cracked. "You have no documentation of anything except your own paranoid fantasies. Any papers you claim to have compiled are the product of an unstable officer looking for someone to blame for her own professional failures. Then you won't mind if the investigators review them." Elena reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick folder containing copies of all the maintenance records, incident reports, and timeline documentation she had compiled over the past 2 weeks. She held it out toward the civilian investigators, who looked between her and Brennan with obvious uncertainty. "Gentlemen, I believe this information may be relevant to your investigation." One of the investigators stepped forward to accept the folder, but Brennan's voice stopped him. "Captain Rodriguez is currently under investigation for multiple violations of military protocol. Any documentation she claims to have compiled is suspect and inadmissible." Elena felt the folder trembling in her hand. This was it. The moment when she either backed down and accepted defeat, or pushed forward and risked everything she had left. She thought about Martinez lying in a hospital bed because of an aircraft that should never have been cleared for flight. She thought about the 12 SEALs she had saved and the price she had paid for saving them. She thought about all the pilots who might face similar accidents if nothing changed. "Gentlemen," Elena said quietly, "I'm willing to stake my career and my reputation on the accuracy of this documentation. The question is whether Colonel Brennan is willing to stake his on proving me wrong." The investigator took the folder. Brennan's face went white with rage, but before he could speak, Torres stepped forward. "Sir, I can verify some of Captain Rodriguez's findings. I've noticed irregularities in maintenance reporting that match the patterns she's describing." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward Torres that was almost overwhelming. He was risking his own career to support her, and they both knew it. Brennan looked around the crash site, taking in the investigators who were now examining Elena's documentation, the emergency crews who had witnessed the entire confrontation, and the other pilots who had gathered to learn about Martinez's condition. His authority was being challenged publicly, and Elena could see him calculating the political cost of his next move. "Captain Rodriguez, you are confined to quarters pending a full disciplinary hearing. Any further interference with official investigations will result in immediate arrest." Elena stood at attention. "Understood, sir." As she walked away from the crash site, Elena felt strangely calm. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, and surprisingly, it felt like freedom. Win or lose, she was finally fighting the fight that mattered. Behind her, she could hear Brennan giving orders to the investigators and demanding that Elena's documentation be treated as evidence of her instability rather than legitimate concerns about safety. But she had seen the expressions on the investigators' faces as they examined her files. They were taking her seriously, which meant Brennan's control over the narrative was no longer absolute. The war was far from over, but the first real battle had finally begun. Elena spent the next 72 hours confined to quarters, but confinement didn't mean isolation. Military bases operated on information networks that flowed through unofficial channels, and Elena discovered that her confrontation with Brennan at the crash site had created ripples throughout the entire unit. The first visitor arrived 12 hours after her confinement began. Master Sergeant Coleman knocked softly on Elena's door at 1900 hours, carrying a toolbox that was supposed to explain her presence in the officer housing area. "Maintenance call," Coleman said loudly enough for anyone listening to hear. Then, more quietly, "We need to talk." Elena let her in and watched as Coleman made a show of checking the ventilation system while speaking in low tones. "The investigators spent 6 hours going through your documentation yesterday. They also requested complete maintenance records for every aircraft that's had mechanical failures in the past year." Coleman's voice was barely audible over the sound of her tools. Brennan tried to claim the records were classified, but the investigators have federal authority. Elena felt her pulse quicken. What did they find? Patterns. Lots of patterns. Coleman finished her fake maintenance work and sat down at Elena's small kitchen table. "Captain, you were right about the falsified records. But it's worse than you thought." Coleman pulled out her phone and showed Elena a series of photographs she had taken of maintenance logs. "These are before and after shots of aircraft inspection reports. Look at the timestamps." Elena examined the images and felt her blood run cold. The pattern was unmistakable. Aircraft that had been cleared for flight were later showing additional problems that had been added to their files days or weeks after their missions. Problems that would have grounded the aircraft if they had existed at the time of flight. How many aircraft? 23 over the past 8 months. All of them flown by pilots who had either questioned Brennan's policies or who were considered potential threats to his authority. Coleman's expression was grim. Captain Martinez's bird was just the latest. A hydraulic failure wasn't a maintenance oversight. It was sabotage. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Elena had suspected fraud and cover-ups, But sabotage was something entirely different. Sabotage was attempted murder. Can you prove it? The investigators think so. They brought in forensic specialists who are examining the wreckage. Coleman leaned forward. But here's the thing, Captain. This investigation is bigger than just our base. They found similar patterns at 2 other installations where Brennan served before coming here. Elena stared at Coleman in shock. This has happened before, apparently. The investigators won't share details, but I overheard one of them talking about established methodology and serial offenses. Coleman glanced toward the window, checking for anyone who might be watching. Captain, I think you stumbled onto something that goes way beyond simple command disputes. Before Elena could respond, there was another soft knock at her door. This time, it was Captain Torres, carrying a manila envelope and looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. I brought your personal effects from the administrative office, Torres said for the benefit of anyone listening. Then, quietly, and some things you need to see. Torres waited until Coleman had checked the door and windows for surveillance before opening the envelope. Inside were photocopies of personnel files, transfer orders, and what appeared to be internal command communications. I've been doing some research on our beloved Colonel, Torres said. His previous assignments make for interesting reading. Elena examined the documents while Torres explained what he had discovered. Brennan's career showed a pattern of rapid promotions and transfers, always moving to new commands before staying long enough to face the long-term consequences of his policies. Look at this. Torres pointed to a set of transfer orders. Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Brennan was there for 18 months. During his tenure, they had an unusually high number of aircraft maintenance issues and pilot safety violations. He left just before a major investigation into training accident patterns. Coleman leaned over to examine the papers. What about? Before that, Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. Same pattern. Increased maintenance problems. Pilots reporting equipment failures during training. Several career-ending incidents involving officers who had questioned his leadership. Torres pulled out another set of documents. He was transferred again just before investigators could complete their work. Elena felt pieces clicking together in her mind. He's done this before, multiple times. Gets worse, Torres continued. I found medical records for pilots who served under him at previous bases. Unusual number of crashes, injuries, and what the reports call pilot error incidents. But when you look at the patterns, they match what we've been seeing here. Elena finished. Coleman shook her head in disgust. How has he gotten away with this for so long? Because he's smart about it, Torres replied. He never stays in one place long enough for investigators to build a complete case. By the time patterns become obvious, he's already been transferred to a new command with glowing recommendations from superiors who want to get rid of him without admitting they had a problem. Elena studied the timeline of Brennan's career, seeing a clear pattern of destruction disguised as professional advancement. How many pilots has he destroyed? Conservative estimate? Based on what I found, at least 30 pilots across 3 different installations have had their careers ended or seriously damaged under suspicious circumstances while serving under Brennan. Torres's voice was quiet but filled with anger. 30 good pilots who were guilty of nothing more than doing their jobs and occasionally questioning authority. Elena felt a cold fury building in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore, or even about Martinez lying in a hospital bed. This was about a systematic pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue for years because people like Brennan knew how to work the system. What about the investigators? Do they know about his history? Some of it. But here's the problem, Torres said, pulling out his phone. I just got word that Brennan has requested an expedited transfer. He's claiming that the stress of the investigation is affecting his ability to command effectively. Coleman cursed under her breath. He's running again. Gets worse. His transfer request has been approved pending resolution of the current investigation. If that investigation concludes without finding definitive proof of criminal wrongdoing, he'll be reassigned to another base within 60 days. Elena stared at the documents spread across her table, seeing years of carefully concealed destruction and abuse. Brennan had perfected the art of destroying careers while maintaining plausible deniability, and he was preparing to do it again. "We need more evidence," she said finally. "Something that connects him directly to the falsified maintenance records." "Already working on it?" Coleman pulled out a small recording device. "I've been documenting conversations with other maintenance personnel. Turns out several of them have been pressured to alter records or ignore safety protocols. They were afraid to speak up because Brennan controls their performance evaluations." Torres nodded. "I've been talking to pilots from his previous commands. Officially, they can't say much without risking their own careers. But unofficially," he paused, "let's just say there are a lot of people who would like to see justice finally catch up with him." Elena felt a plan beginning to form in her mind. What if we could get them to testify? All of them, from multiple bases, showing the same patterns of abuse. You'd need someone with authority to compel testimony across multiple commands, Coleman pointed out. That's not something base-level investigators can do. No, but federal investigators can. Elena stood up and began pacing her small quarters. "Torres, those investigators who are examining my documentation, what exactly is their authority?" "They're from the Inspector General's office. They investigate fraud and misconduct across all military branches." Torres's eyes lit up with understanding. "If we could show them a pattern extending beyond just this base, they'd have to treat it as a federal case," Elena finished. "Which means Brennan couldn't just transfer his way out of it." Coleman grinned for the first time since Elena had known her. "And federal investigators have the authority to freeze transfers pending completion of their investigation." The three of them spent the next 2 hours planning their approach. They would need to contact pilots and maintenance personnel from Brennan's previous commands, document similar patterns of abuse, and present it all to the investigators as evidence of a criminal conspiracy spanning multiple installations. It was dangerous. If Brennan discovered what they were doing, he could destroy all three of their careers before they could complete their case. But Elena thought about Martinez in the hospital, about the 30 pilots whose careers had been ended by one man's ego and cruelty, and she knew they had to try. "There's something else," Torres said as they prepared to leave. "The investigators asked me about your canyon rescue mission, the one that started all this." Elena looked up. "What about it?" "They wanted to know if you had been following established protocols when you made that flight." Torres's expression was serious. "I told them the truth, that you had followed every relevant protocol except requesting permission from a commander who would have denied it and cost 12 men their lives. And they seemed very interested in the fact that Brennan punished you for succeeding at a mission that saved lives, while he's been covering up maintenance failures that could have cost lives." Torres stood up. "Elena, I think the investigators are beginning to see this case very differently than Brennan expected." After Coleman and Torres left, Elena sat alone in her quarters, looking at the evidence they had compiled. For the first time since her grounding, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: the possibility of actual justice. Brennan had built his career on the assumption that individual pilots were powerless against the military bureaucracy, that he could destroy careers with impunity as long as he maintained the appearance of following regulations. But he had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that his victims would remain isolated, that they would accept their fate quietly rather than risk what remained of their careers by fighting back. He hadn't counted on someone like Elena, who was willing to lose everything to stop him. And he certainly hadn't counted on federal investigators who had the authority to look beyond his carefully constructed facade and see the pattern of destruction. Underneath, Alana pulled out her laptop and began drafting a comprehensive timeline of Brennan's career, connecting his transfers to the incidents at each base, documenting the lives he had destroyed and the safety violations he had covered up. It would take time to verify everything, time to contact all the witnesses they would need. But for the first time since this fight began, Elena felt like she had weapons that could actually hurt him. Outside her window, she could hear the sound of aircraft taking off for evening training flights. Soon, she told herself, she would be flying again. But more importantly, soon other pilots would be able to fly without fear that their own commander was sabotaging their aircraft and their careers. The war was far from over, but Elena could finally see a path to victory. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena was reviewing maintenance documentation on her laptop when her secure email chimed with a message from an address she didn't recognize. The sender identified himself as Captain David Chun, formerly of Nellis Air Force Base, and his first line made Elena's heart race. Captain Rodriguez, I heard about your investigation into Colonel Brennan. I think we need to talk. Elena stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Chun could be legitimate, or he could be one of Brennan's allies trying to gather intelligence on her activities. But the details in his email suggested he knew things about Brennan's time at Nellis that weren't in any official records. She decided to take the risk. Within 6 hours, Elena had been contacted by 14 pilots from 3 different bases where Brennan had served. Each one had a story that followed the same devastating pattern: questionable maintenance records, career-ending accidents, and investigations that somehow never quite managed to find definitive proof of wrongdoing. The most disturbing message came from Major Jennifer Walsh, who had served under Brennan at Fort Campbell 3 years earlier. Captain Rodriguez, I was grounded for 8 months after what they called pilot error during a training exercise. My aircraft allegedly suffered multiple system failures that I should have detected before takeoff. Except the maintenance records were altered after my flight to make it look like I had ignored warning signs that never existed. I eventually transferred to another unit, but my career never recovered. I heard Martinez got hurt. Don't let him do to her what he did to me. Elena forwarded all the messages to the federal investigators, who responded by requesting a formal conference call with Elena and her key witnesses. The call was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Elena spent the entire morning preparing for what she knew would be the most important conversation of her career. Coleman and Torres arrived at Elena's quarters 30 minutes before the scheduled call, both carrying files that had grown significantly thicker over the past week. The investigation had taken on a life of its own, with maintenance personnel and pilots coming forward from across the country to share their experiences. With Brennan's leadership, the investigators said they've never seen anything like this, Torres reported. The pattern is so consistent across multiple installations that they're treating it as an organized criminal conspiracy. Elena felt a mixture of vindication and horror. How many people has he hurt? Current count is 43 pilots and 16 maintenance personnel whose careers were damaged or destroyed under suspicious circumstances, Coleman replied. And those are just the ones willing to go on record. The conference call connected them with Agent Patricia Hayes from the Inspector General's office and Agent Michael Foster from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Both agents had been working on the case for over a week, and their tone suggested they had discovered things that went beyond even Elena's suspicions. Captain Rodriguez, we want to thank you for bringing this matter to our attention, Agent Hayes began. Your documentation has helped us identify patterns that we might not have noticed otherwise. What have you found? Elena asked. Evidence of systematic fraud spanning at least 5 years and 4 different installations, Agent Foster replied. Kyle Brennan appears to have developed what we can only describe as a methodology for destroying the careers of subordinates while maintaining plausible deniability. Agent Hayes continued. The maintenance record alterations are just one part of a larger pattern. We've also found evidence of falsified performance evaluations, manipulated incident reports, and what appears to be deliberate assignment of problematic aircraft to pilots who had questioned his authority. Elena felt her hands clenching. What about Captain Martinez's crash? Preliminary forensic analysis suggests her hydraulic failure was the result of deliberate sabotage, Agent Foster said. Someone introduced contaminants into the hydraulic system that would cause gradual degradation, leading to catastrophic failure during high-stress maneuvers. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Martinez hadn't just been the victim of negligence or cover-ups. Someone had deliberately tried to kill her. Can you prove Brennan was responsible? We're working on it. But here's where we need your help, Agent Hayes said. Brennan has requested an expedited transfer, and his superiors are inclined to approve it to avoid the negative publicity of a prolonged investigation. We need definitive evidence linking him directly to the sabotage and fraud before he can disappear into another command. Coleman leaned forward toward the phone. What kind of evidence? Documentation showing he ordered or approved the maintenance record alterations. Testimony from someone who witnessed him giving instructions to sabotage aircraft. Communication records showing he coordinated with others to carry out these activities. Torres shook his head. He's too smart to leave that kind of paper trail. He's been doing this for years without getting caught. Which brings us to our proposal. Agent Foster said, we want to set up a controlled operation to catch him in the act. But it would require putting one of you at significant personal risk. Elena felt her pulse quicken. What kind of operation? We want to create a situation where Brennan believes he needs to eliminate another threat to his authority. We'll provide surveillance and protection, but the target would need to convincingly appear vulnerable while actually being monitored. The implication was clear. They wanted to use Elena as bait to catch Brennan attempting another act of sabotage. The risks are considerable, Agent Hayes continued. If something goes wrong, if our surveillance fails, or if Brennan suspects the operation, you could be in serious danger. Elena looked at Coleman and Torres, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. She thought about Martinez in the hospital, about the 43 pilots whose careers had been destroyed, about the pattern of abuse that would continue unless someone stopped it. What would I need to do? We want to reinstate you to limited flight status and assign you to a high-profile training mission. Brennan will see this as undermining his authority and will likely attempt to sabotage your aircraft or create another accident to discredit you permanently. Coleman's voice was tense. You're asking her to fly an aircraft that someone might have sabotaged. We'll have the aircraft under constant surveillance. Any attempt to tamper with it will be documented and interrupted if necessary. But we need Brennan to believe he has an opportunity to act. Elena closed her eyes, thinking through the implications. It was dangerous, possibly fatal if something went wrong. But it was also the best chance they had to stop Brennan before he transferred to another base and started the cycle all over again. I'll do it. Elena, you don't have to. Torres started. Yes, I do. Elena's voice was firm. This ends here. No more pilots are going to have their careers destroyed. No more maintenance personnel are going to be pressured into compromising safety. And nobody else is going to end up like Martinez. Agent Hayes' voice carried a note of respect. Captain Rodriguez, we'll need to coordinate this operation carefully. The reinstatement will need to appear routine to avoid suspicion. Are you prepared to return to flight status while maintaining the appearance that you're unaware of our investigation? I've been preparing for this fight since the day he grounded me, Elena replied. Let's finish it. The call ended with plans for Elena's reinstatement to be processed within 48 hours. She would be assigned to a high-profile canyon rescue. Training exercise, exactly the kind of mission that had originally gotten her in trouble with Brennan. After the agents hung up, the three of them sat in silence for several minutes. You know this could kill you, Coleman said finally. So could doing nothing. Elena stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for evening missions. Coleman, how long would it take someone to sabotage an aircraft in a way that would cause failure during a canyon flight? With access to the maintenance bay? Maybe 20 minutes for something subtle that wouldn't be detected during routine inspection. Elena nodded. And how long to detect and document that sabotage if you knew what to look for? Coleman's expression grew thoughtful. With the right equipment and enough time, we could catch them in the act. Torres leaned forward. You're thinking about more than just surveillance, aren't you? Elena turned back to face them. I'm thinking that if we're going to take this risk, we might as well make sure we get everything we need to put him away permanently. Over the next hour, they refined the plan that would either end Brennan's career or cost Elena her life. It was dangerous, complicated, and dependent on dozens of variables beyond their control. But it was also their best chance to finally achieve justice for all the pilots, whose careers Brennan had destroyed. Outside Elena's window, the sun was setting. Over the flight line, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Tomorrow, she would return to flight status for the first time in weeks. And tomorrow, one way or another, the war between Elena Rodriguez and Colonel Marcus Brennan would finally reach its conclusion. Elena's reinstatement came through official channels at 0700 hours on Thursday morning, delivered by a junior administrative officer who seemed puzzled by the paperwork he was carrying. Captain Rodriguez, you're cleared to return to limited flight status effective immediately. You're assigned to training exercise Bravo 7, scheduled for 1400 hours today. Elena examined the orders, noting that they bore Colonel Brennan's signature and appeared to have been processed through normal channels. To anyone watching, her return to flight status would look like routine administrative correction rather than part of a federal investigation. What type of exercise? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Canyon rescue simulation. You'll be flying. Solo approach patterns in Sector 7C. The officer paused. Sir, are you sure you're ready for this? I mean, after what happened to Captain Martinez. Elena felt a chill at the mention of the sector where Martinez had nearly died, but kept her expression neutral. I'm ready, Airman. Thank you. After the officer left, Elena dressed in her flight suit for the first time in weeks. The familiar weight of the gear felt both comforting and ominous. She was about to return to the sky, but under circumstances that could easily make this flight, her last. Elena arrived at the flight line 90 minutes early. Ostensibly to conduct a thorough pre-flight inspection, but actually to give the surveillance team time to set up their monitoring equipment. Agent Hayes had assured her that the aircraft would be under constant observation, but Elena wanted to see the setup for herself. Her assigned aircraft was tail number 8157, a Warthog that had been fully refurbished after returning from overseas deployment. It looked perfect, which made Elena immediately suspicious. In her experience, aircraft that looked too good usually had something to hide. Master Sergeant Coleman appeared as Elena was beginning her inspection, carrying a maintenance clipboard and wearing the poker face that had served her well during 20 years of military service. Captain Rodriguez, good to see you back on the flight line, Coleman said loudly enough for nearby personnel to hear. Then, more quietly, everything's in place. We've got micro cameras positioned to cover every approach to your bird, and the entire maintenance bay is under surveillance. Elena nodded while continuing her visual inspection of the aircraft. Any sign of Brennan? He made a personal visit to the maintenance bay this morning. Claimed he wanted to ensure that your aircraft received special attention, given the recent safety incidents. Coleman's expression was grim. He spent about 15 minutes examining the hydraulic systems. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Did surveillance capture everything? Every second. But he didn't do anything obvious. Just looked around, asked some questions about maintenance procedures, made some comments about the importance of thorough inspections. Elena completed her pre-flight check without finding any obvious problems, but that didn't reassure her. If Brennan was as sophisticated as the investigators believed, any sabotage would be subtle enough to escape. Routine inspection while causing catastrophic failure under operational stress. At 13:30 hours, Elena received her final briefing from Lieutenant Colonel Parker, who seemed unusually nervous about the training exercise. Captain Rodriguez, I want to emphasize that this is a low-risk familiarization flight. You're to practice approach patterns only. No aggressive maneuvering, no extended low-altitude flight, no pushing operational envelopes. Elena studied Parker's face, wondering if he was part of Brennan's conspiracy or simply a career officer trying to avoid another incident that would reflect poorly on the unit. Understood, sir. Standard approach patterns only. Good. And Rodriguez? Parker paused at the door. Be careful out there. I know things have been difficult lately, but I don't want to lose another good pilot. Elena suited up and walked to her aircraft, aware that dozens of eyes were watching her every move. Some belonged to the surveillance team, others to maintenance. Personnel and fellow pilots who knew this flight represented her return from professional exile. As she climbed into the cockpit, Elena felt the familiar surge of anticipation that always preceded flight. But this time, it was mixed with a cold awareness that someone might have spent the morning rigging her aircraft to fail at the worst possible moment. She completed her startup procedures methodically, running through every system check twice and comparing all readings to normal parameters. Everything appeared nominal, but Elena had learned not to trust appearances where Colonel Brennan was concerned. Tower, this is Stormcaller requesting clearance for departure. Stormcaller, you are cleared for takeoff. Fly safe out there, Captain. Elena taxied to the runway, completed her final checks, and advanced the throttles. The Warthog accelerated smoothly down the concrete, and she lifted off into clear afternoon sky with no indication of mechanical problems. For the first 20 minutes of flight, everything proceeded normally. Elena flew standard approach patterns toward the training canyon, practicing the type of precision flying that had made her one of the most respected pilots in the unit. Her aircraft responded perfectly to every input, showing no signs of the hydraulic problems that had nearly killed Martinez. But as Elena began her descent toward the canyon for her first low-altitude approach, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The hydraulic pressure gauge was reading normal, but the response to her control inputs felt slightly different than it should have. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly what normal felt like. But Elena had flown enough hours in Warthogs to recognize when something wasn't quite right. She keyed her radio. Tower, this is Stormcaller. I'm detecting possible hydraulic irregularities. Requesting permission to abort the exercise and return to base. There was a pause before the tower responded. Stormcaller, please specify the nature of your hydraulic concerns. Elena hesitated. If she was wrong about the sabotage, calling off the exercise for vague mechanical concerns would make her look paranoid and unreliable. But if she was right, continuing the flight could be fatal. Tower, I'm reading normal pressure, but control response feels inconsistent. I'd like to have maintenance examine the system before continuing. Stormcaller, stand by. Alana continued, flying level while waiting for a response, but she could feel the hydraulic problems getting worse. The control stick was requiring more pressure to achieve the same responses, and she could see slight fluctuations in the pressure gauge that hadn't been there at the beginning of the flight. Stormcaller, Tower, you are cleared to return to base. Immediately, emergency crews are standing by. Elena felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The surveillance team had obviously detected something that confirmed her suspicions about sabotage. She began a gentle turn back toward the base, avoiding any aggressive maneuvering that might stress the compromised hydraulic system. But as she leveled out on her return heading, the pressure gauge suddenly dropped to 0 and the control stick went limp in her hands. Total hydraulic failure. At 8,000 feet over hostile terrain, with no backup systems and limited options for emergency landing, Elena felt the familiar calm that had carried her through dozens of combat missions. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had perhaps 10 minutes to find a way to get her crippled aircraft on the ground before it became uncontrollable. She switched to emergency radio frequency. Mayday, Mayday, this is Stormcaller. I have total hydraulic failure and am attempting emergency landing procedures. The response came immediately. Stormcaller, this is base emergency control. We have you on radar. What is your current status? Aircraft is controllable using engine power modulation, but I'm losing altitude and have limited maneuvering capability. Elena scanned the terrain below, looking for anywhere flat enough to attempt a crash landing. I need vectors to the nearest suitable landing site. Stormcaller, there's an emergency strip at bearing 270, distance 12 miles. Can you make it that far? Elena calculated quickly. At her current rate of descent, she might reach the emergency strip with a few hundred feet of altitude. To spare might. I'm going to try. Be advised, this will be a dead stick landing with no hydraulic assistance. Elena nursed the crippled warthog through the sky, using tiny adjustments in engine power to maintain something resembling controlled flight. Below her, she could see emergency vehicles racing across the desert toward the landing strip, kicking up clouds of dust that marked their progress. As she approached the emergency strip, Elena realized she was coming in too fast and too high. With no hydraulics, she couldn't lower flaps or landing gear, which meant she would have to attempt a belly landing at nearly twice normal approach speed. Emergency control. I'm coming in hot with no gear and no flaps. Clear the area and have fire suppression ready. Elena lined up with the runway and began her final approach, fighting to control an aircraft that wanted to fall out of the sky. The ground rushed up toward her with terrifying speed, and she had one chance to get the landing right at the last possible second. Elena cut the engines and pulled back on the stick with all her strength. The warthog hit the runway hard, bounced once, then slammed down again and slid for nearly a mile before finally grinding to a halt in a shower of sparks and torn metal. Elena sat in the cockpit for several seconds, hardly believing she was still alive. Then she heard the sound of approaching fire trucks and realized that her part of the operation was complete. Colonel Brennan had just tried to kill her, and federal investigators had documented every second of it. Now came the interesting part. Elena was still sitting in the cockpit of her wrecked aircraft when Agent Hayes arrived at the crash site. The federal investigator appeared calm and professional, but Elena could see satisfaction in her eyes as she approached the twisted metal that had once been a pristine A-10 Warthog. Captain Rodriguez, are you injured? Nothing serious. Elena climbed out of the cockpit with help from the emergency crew, her legs shaky from adrenaline, but otherwise functional. Please tell me you got what you needed. Agent Hayes smiled grimly. We got everything, and more than we expected. Over the next 3 hours, Elena learned the full extent of what the surveillance operation had uncovered. The sabotage of her aircraft had been far more sophisticated than anyone anticipated, involving not just Brennan, but a network of accomplices who had been helping him destroy careers for years. The hydraulic contamination was introduced during a routine maintenance check this morning, Agent Foster explained as they reviewed surveillance footage in a secure conference room. But it wasn't done by Brennan personally. He had Technical Sergeant Kevin Walsh do the actual work. Elena studied the video on Foster's laptop. Watching a maintenance technician she barely knew carefully introducing foreign material into her aircraft's hydraulic system. Walsh was working for Brennan? Walsh was being blackmailed by Brennan. We found evidence that Brennan had fabricated disciplinary charges against Walsh's son, who's stationed at another base. Walsh was told his son would face court-martial unless he followed orders without question. Agent Hayes pulled out another file. That's how Brennan maintained his network. He found leverage over maintenance personnel, junior officers, and administrative staff, then used that leverage to force them to participate in his operations. Elena felt sick as the implications became clear. How many people were involved at this base? At least 7 that we've identified so far. Across all his previous commands? We're still counting, but it appears to be in the dozens. Agent Foster showed Elena additional surveillance footage from the maintenance bay. But here's the part that's going to put him away permanently. We caught Brennan giving direct orders to Walsh about your aircraft. He specifically instructed him to introduce contaminants that would cause gradual hydraulic failure during high-stress maneuvering. Elena watched the video of Brennan calmly discussing the best way to make her aircraft fail catastrophically, and felt a cold fury building in her chest. This wasn't just about career destruction anymore. Brennan had crossed the line into attempted murder. What's his status now? Under arrest. We took him into custody 20 minutes after your aircraft went down. Agent Hayes' expression was grim. He's been charged with conspiracy, fraud, sabotage, and attempted murder of a federal officer. He won't be transferring to another command. Elena felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. What about the others? The people he blackmailed into helping him? That depends on their level of cooperation. Walsh is already talking, providing details about other incidents we hadn't identified. Most of the maintenance personnel were victims as much as accomplices. Agent Foster leaned forward. Captain Rodriguez, we're going to need extensive testimony from you about your experiences under Brennan's command. This case is going to trial, and it's going to be a big one. Elena nodded. Whatever you need. There's something else, Agent Hayes said. The investigation has revealed patterns of systemic abuse that go beyond Brennan's individual actions. The Air Force is conducting a comprehensive review of command structures and oversight procedures. Your case has exposed weaknesses that allowed this kind of abuse to continue for years. Elena thought about all the pilots whose careers had been destroyed, all the maintenance personnel who had been pressured into compromising safety, all the near misses and actual crashes that could have been prevented if someone had stopped Brennan earlier. What happens to his victims? The pilots whose careers he destroyed? That's still being determined. But I can tell you that several high-ranking officials are very interested in finding ways to restore careers and reputations that were damaged by fraudulent evidence. A knock at the conference room door interrupted their conversation. Master Sergeant Coleman entered, carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Agent Hayes, I thought you should see this immediately. Coleman opened the folder to reveal printed emails, maintenance records, and what appeared to be financial documents. We found Brennan's personal computer in his quarters. He kept detailed records of everything. Elena stared at the papers in shock. He documented his own crimes? Apparently, he thought he was building a case study for some kind of military leadership manual he planned to write after retirement, Coleman explained. He called it maintaining command authority through strategic personnel management. Agent Foster examined the documents with growing amazement. This is a complete handbook for destroying subordinates' careers while maintaining plausible deniability. He documented methods, target selection criteria, risk assessment procedures, and names, Agent Hayes added grimly. Names of everyone who helped him, everyone he targeted, and everyone he planned to target in the future. Elena looked at the papers spread across the conference table, seeing her own name in several places, along with detailed plans for her character assassination and professional destruction. But she also saw dozens of other names, representing careers that had been damaged or destroyed over the span of Brennan's command. How many people are we talking about? Based on these records, over 100 officers and enlisted personnel across his entire career, Coleman replied. Some minor incidents, some career-ending. All of it carefully planned and executed. Agent Hayes began organizing the documents. This changes everything. What we thought was opportunistic abuse of authority turns out to be a systematic program of terrorism against his own personnel. Elena felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they had uncovered. One man's ego and cruelty had damaged hundreds of careers and lives, all while he advanced through the ranks and received commendations for his leadership. What happens now? Now we notify every victim we can identify and begin the process of correcting the record, Agent Foster replied. And we make sure that Colonel Marcus Brennan never has authority over another human being for the rest of his life. Elena looked out the window toward the flight line, where aircraft were being prepared for evening missions. For the first time in weeks, she could watch other pilots preparing for flight without feeling the bitter taste of injustice and powerlessness. Agent Hayes, when this goes to trial, I want to testify. Not just about what happened to me, but about all of it. Someone needs to speak for the pilots who aren't here anymore. Captain Rodriguez, you'll have every opportunity to tell your story. And thanks to your courage in pursuing this investigation, a lot of other people will finally have the chance to tell theirs as well. As the investigators packed up their evidence and prepared to leave, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since the day Brennan grounded her. Hope for the future. The war was over, and justice had finally won. 6 months later, Elena stood in a federal courthouse watching Colonel Marcus Brennan receive a sentence of 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, sabotage, and multiple counts of attempted murder. The courtroom was packed with pilots, maintenance personnel, and family members whose lives had been affected by his systematic campaign of abuse. The trial had been a media sensation, exposing a level of military corruption that shocked both the public and senior Pentagon officials. Brennan's detailed records had provided prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of crimes spanning nearly a decade, and his conviction had been swift and decisive. The defendant systematically abused his position of authority to destroy the careers and endanger the lives of the very personnel he was sworn to protect. Judge Patricia Williams said as she announced the sentence. His actions represent a betrayal of military values and human decency that demands the severest possible punishment. Elena watched Brennan's face as the sentence was read, seeing no remorse or acknowledgement of the damage he had caused. Even in defeat, he remained convinced that his actions had been justified by the requirements of command authority. After the sentencing, Elena joined the crowd of Brennan's victims outside the courthouse. Many of them were pilots whose careers had been restored after investigators proved their supposed failures had been fabricated. Others were maintenance personnel who had been freed from years of blackmail and coercion. Captain Martinez approached Elena, walking with a slight limp that was the only visible reminder of her crash. Elena, I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't fought back, You don't need to thank me, Elena replied. You would have done the same thing. Maybe, but you're the one who actually did it. Martinez smiled. Any regrets? Elena considered the question. The investigation and trial had cost her months of her career, subjected her to intense scrutiny, and nearly gotten her killed. But it had also exposed a pattern of abuse that might have continued for years if no one had been willing to take the risk of fighting back. No regrets, she said finally. The crowd began to disperse, but Elena remained on the courthouse steps for several more minutes, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. It had started with a simple rescue mission in a canyon that every other pilot had declared impossible to fly. It had nearly ended with her death in a sabotaged aircraft over that same canyon, but it had concluded with justice for more than 100 victims of systematic abuse and reforms that would make it much harder for future commanders to abuse their authority with impunity. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Hayes. Captain Rodriguez, your new assignment orders are ready. Report to Nellis AFB Monday for briefing on your new position. Congratulations, Major Rodriguez. Elena stared at the message, reading it twice to make sure she understood correctly. The promotion to Major had been part of the Air Force's effort to restore her career after proving that her grounding had been based on fraudulent evidence. But the assignment to Nellis was unexpected. She called Agent Hayes immediately. What kind of position at Nellis? You're being assigned to the Inspector General's office as a special investigator. Your job will be to identify and investigate patterns of command abuse before they reach the level of what happened with Brennan. Elena felt a surge of excitement. You want me to hunt down other commanders like Brennan? We want you to make sure there are no other commanders like Brennan. Your experience gives you unique insight into how this kind of abuse develops and operates. Plus, you've proven you're willing to take risks to protect fellow service members. Elena looked up at the clear blue sky above the courthouse, thinking about all the pilots who were flying missions today without fear that their own commanders were plotting to destroy them. That was worth fighting for. When do I start? Monday morning. But Elena, take the weekend off. Go fly something. You've earned it. Elena drove back to the base where her ordeal had begun, passing the same hangars and flight lines where she had watched Brennan systematically destroy careers and lives. But now those buildings represented something different. Justice served and accountability restored. She found Master Sergeant Coleman in Hangar 4, working on the same type of warthog that Elena had crashed during the investigation. Coleman looked up as Elena approached, her face breaking into a wide grin. Major Rodriguez, I heard about the promotion and the new assignment. Congratulations. Thank you, Sergeant Coleman. I couldn't have done any of this without your help. Just doing my job, ma'am. Making sure that the guys can keep flying. Coleman gestured toward the aircraft she was working on. Speaking of which, this bird is ready for flight if you're interested. Fully inspected, all systems green, and I personally guarantee there's nothing wrong with her that shouldn't be there. Elena looked at the warthog, feeling the familiar pull of the sky that had driven her entire career. It had been months since she had flown for pleasure rather than survival, and the idea of taking to the air without the weight of investigation and danger was almost overwhelming. Is that an invitation, Sergeant? It's whatever you want it to be, Major. But if you're asking my professional opinion, I think you need to get back up there and remember why we do this job. Elena spent the next hour conducting a thorough pre-flight inspection, not because she didn't trust Coleman's work, but because the familiar routine helped her reconnect with the aircraft and the mission that had defined her life. Every system check, every control surface movement, every gauge reading reminded her of who she was beneath all the titles and investigations and legal proceedings. She was Elena Rodriguez, call sign Stormcaller, and she was a pilot. The takeoff was smooth and effortless, lifting her away from the complications of ground-based politics and into the clean simplicity of controlled flight. Elena climbed to 8,000 feet and leveled off, looking down at the base where she had fought the most important battle of her career. From this altitude, the buildings and runways looked peaceful and orderly. There was no sign of the corruption and abuse that had festered within those structures, no indication of the lives that had been damaged by one man's twisted vision of leadership. But Elena knew that the scars of Brennan's command would take years to fully heal, and that constant vigilance would be required to prevent similar abuse from taking root elsewhere. She banked the aircraft toward the west, flying over the canyon, where she had conducted her unauthorized rescue mission so many months ago. The terrain looked exactly the same, harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in its deadly simplicity. But Alana's perspective had changed completely. The canyon was no longer just a tactical challenge or a symbol of regulatory conflict. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important fights weren't against external enemies, but against the corruption and cruelty that could flourish within supposedly safe institutions. Elena's radio crackled with a transmission from the tower. "Stormcaller, we have traffic approaching from the south. Appears to be a formation of 4 aircraft requesting permission to join you." Elena looked toward the south and saw 4 warthogs approaching in tight formation. As they drew closer, she recognized the tail numbers of aircraft flown by pilots who had testified at Brennan's trial. Torres was leading the formation, with Martinez on his wing, and 2 other pilots Elena had worked with during the investigation. "Stormcaller, this is Devil Flight requesting permission to escort you home." Torres's voice came through her headset. Elena felt a surge of emotion that had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with the bonds forged through shared struggle. These pilots had risked their careers to support her investigation, and now they were flying together as friends and equals rather than victims of systematic abuse. "Devil Flight, you are cleared to join formation. Welcome to the sky." The 5 aircraft flew together in perfect harmony, their engines harmonizing in a sound that Elena had always thought of as freedom made audible. Below them, the desert stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, and above them, the sky opened into infinite blue possibility. Elena thought about her new assignment at Nellis, about the responsibility she would have to protect other pilots from the kind of abuse they had all endured. It would be challenging work, requiring her to investigate fellow officers and expose uncomfortable truths about military culture and leadership. But as she flew in formation with pilots whose careers had been restored and whose futures were once again bright with possibility, Elena knew she was exactly where she belonged. They flew for another hour, practicing formation maneuvers and enjoying the simple pleasure of controlled flight with trusted companions. When they finally turned back toward base, Elena felt more complete than she had in months. As they approached the runway for landing, Elena keyed her radio one final time. "Devil Flight, it's been an honor flying with you." "The honor was ours, Stormcaller," Torres replied. "See you in the sky." Elena landed smoothly and taxied to the flight line, where Coleman was waiting with a crew to service the aircraft. As she shut down the engines and completed her post-flight checklist, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from a mission successfully completed. But this mission wasn't just a single flight. It was the completion of a transformation that had begun the day she chose to fly into that canyon to save 12 trapped SEALs. She had started that journey as a pilot who followed orders and trusted the system to protect those who served it faithfully. She was ending it as someone who understood that sometimes the most important orders were the ones you gave yourself, and that protecting the system meant being willing to fight the people who corrupted it. Elena climbed out of the cockpit and looked up at the clear evening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere up there, other pilots were flying missions, training for combat. and preparing to risk their lives in service of causes larger than themselves. Her job now was to make sure that when those pilots looked down at their own commanders and institutions, they would see protectors rather than predators, leaders rather than tyrants, and justice rather than the arbitrary exercise of power. It was a big responsibility. But Elena had learned something important during her fight against Brennan. Sometimes one person willing to take a stand could change everything. As she walked toward the operations building to file her flight report, Elena heard the sound of jet engines starting up for night training missions. Other pilots were taking off into the darkness, trusting their aircraft, their training, and their commanders to bring them home safely. Thanks to the investigation and trial that had consumed the past 6 months, that trust was no longer misplaced. Elena Rodriguez, Major, United States Air Force, callsign Stormcaller, walked into the building and began preparing for the next phase of her career. There were other commanders to investigate, other victims to protect, and other battles to fight in the endless war between justice and corruption. But for the first time since her unauthorized canyon rescue, she was fighting on the right side, with the full support of the system she had sworn to serve. And above the base, the night sky waited patiently for her return. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.